Well, it's really a pleasure to be with you folks here today. And I have been meeting with a number of you for the pod leaders training and encouragement. But, you know, when you have too many gaps in between, I forget your names. So any of you who think I know your name, just I'll let that go, because I'm Stan Hagemeyer, so that way you remember my name now for the next 30 minutes. That's all. I wonder if you've ever been in a tough spot where you were really kind of overwhelmed with emotions, but you wanted really hard not to break down and cry. I'll bet at least 90% of you did. And there are different kinds of circumstances where people are in those situations. Some of them are good, some of them are tough. I did have an uncle who was one of those guys who I remember with one of my cousins said, "You better shut up or I'll give you something to cry about." You know how that was. But today, I'm going to read in a few moments this passage in Genesis, which is a climactic conclusion, at least a climactic spot in a great story. The story is the one of Joseph and his 11 brothers. And in order for you to have it in the right place in your mind, I need to tell you the backstory for a little bit. You probably remember that Joseph was the son of Jacob, or Israel. And among other things, he was spoiled a little bit because Jacob had waited so many years to have a baby with his favorite wife. Now, you know, those were the days. Anyway, and so he favored him, and he gave him a coat of many colors. And then when he went out to see his brothers out in the field one time, he told them about some dreams he had, which made them think he really thinks he's much bigger and better than we are. And they got so upset with him, they threw him down in a well to keep him from getting away. And then they sold him to some traders who were heading to Egypt. That's the tough part of the story, or a tough part. And as you might remember, when he got to Egypt, he was put to work for a fellow who was a leader of a sort, in charge of something or other. And then his wife tried to make a pass at Joseph, and then she had hold of his cloak, and then he ran away, and then she told her husband, "He tried to rape me." And so then he put him in jail, and he was in prison for a number of years. Met some people there, and eventually interpreted a dream for somebody, which led to eventually the Pharaoh having some crazy dreams, and nobody could interpret them. And this butler said, I think it was the butler, said, "Oh, I met a guy in prison. Let's bring him here and he can talk to you about your dreams," which led to what? The Pharaoh said, "Wow, this man is the wisest man in Egypt. I want him in charge of the whole country." So he went from being in prison to being the prime minister. Now, in the meantime, after, I feel like I'm a little too loud, but I don't know. Is that all right for you folks? All right. Preach it, brother. That's what they would say in some churches. So after these 7 good years with rich harvests, and Joseph was in charge of the federal farm program and had all of the extra stock stored up, the famine years came. And after a couple of years, his family, his brothers and his father and all those people who lived further away back in the area close to Israel, they were in real trouble. And of course, then Jacob sent some of his brothers to Egypt to get grain. And when they met Joseph, they didn't recognize him, of course, because he was, for one thing, he shouldn't be the leader of Egypt, you know. And he would have worn a headdress. He would have had a lot of makeup on. That was the way they dressed up their leaders. Well, anyway, they got some grain one time and went back. And at some point, he told them, you have another brother, don't you? And that was his brother Benjamin, who was not with him. And he said, I want him here the next time you come or you don't get any grain. He's trying to manipulate them. And they couldn't figure out why this guy wants so much or why he cares about our family at all. And then when they finally come the second time and he fills their sacks, he has his helpers take care of that, of course. And he plants a silver cup in the sack that's going to be carried by Benjamin. Then he has them arrested and brought back and told, well, you've stolen my silver cup, so I'm going to keep this guy here. And there was this big to-do. There's this weeping and wailing and saying, but our father will die if his youngest son doesn't come home. So that's all behind what I'm going to read now. So, I know, I was going to tell you. Why is there this discord in this family in the first place? Well, you have to picture this. I'll say it real quickly. Leah, his first wife, had Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, and Dinah, the girl. Then he had 2 children with her maid, Gad and Asher. Well, then with his favorite wife, Rachel, he finally had Joseph and Benjamin. And with Rachel's maid, Bilhah, he had Dan and Naphtali. So you have fractures in loyalty in this family. So now that helps for you to hear that. Okay, now Joseph had been holding back because he sees his brother Benjamin, who is the youngest of the family. He just loves him. And he's seeing his brothers who he just, he's long ago forgiven them for what they did, although it was terrible. And finally it says, then Joseph, this is Genesis 45, then Joseph could no longer control himself in front of his attendants, and he cried out, have everybody leave my presence. He didn't want any of his attendants, his servants, and his whatever. So there's no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear him in the other room. And Pharaoh's household heard about it. What's going on with Joseph? Joseph then said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Can you imagine how those guys felt? How they thought he was long dead. I'm Joseph, come close to me and see. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Now don't be so distressed, don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land. And for the next 5 years, there's still going to be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you for a remnant on the earth and to save your lives. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You and your children and grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and all you have made, all you have. I will provide for you here, because 5 years of famine are still to come. And then verse 12, you can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it's really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and everything you have seen, and bring my father here quickly. Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. He cried some more. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and cried over them. And afterward, his brothers talked with him. And then, let's see, I'm supposed to read a little further. And then the news reached Pharaoh's palace, and that Joseph's brothers had come. And Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. And Pharaoh told Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan. Bring your father and your families back to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land." Well, most people who've ever heard a sermon on this passage, usually preachers focus on the fact, which is really powerful, that God saw this and God intended it for good. The terrible mess of his brothers hating him, of him being in prison, of him being accused of a crime he didn't commit, of him just going through terrible, tough years, was nevertheless used by God to make a circumstance where he could save his family and basically create the foundation for what we consider the Jewish nation of today. All the people in the world that are Jews or descendants of Jacob have come through this wonderful thing. Now, that isn't what I'm going to preach on today. I just wanted to summarize that so you'd say, well, that's not the main idea in the passage. Well, what I find really amazing here is that this is a story where people are all crying. They just can't hold it back. It's too... You see, the first thing that happens is they're all keeping up a front. I mean, Joseph in his position, he has a front. He is a front. He's a public official that everybody thinks is almost like God, and he would never show emotion. He would give orders. He would say, do this. And when people ran out of money, he said, tell them they have to sign over their land to us. Well, first they did it they tell them to sign over their animals to us because we have the grain. And then later he arranged for them to mortgage their farms and all this sort of thing. You know, I mean, he was the big boss. So nobody ever saw him even probably smile, let alone break down and cry. But this was too important. And so he says, send all my servants out. Get out of here. Because he didn't really want them to see. But in front of his brothers, he says, it just all comes out. Tears and wailing and a celebration of tears. I have a feeling most of you at some point in your life might have been so happy you were crying. That's what was happening here. And when his father heard it, he said, oh, now I can go see Joseph and then I can die. That's all. That's good enough. Now, today, I want to ask, can we be real like Joseph? Can we break down beyond the barriers and be real? Because we have a natural conflict in us. We want people to respect us and to know, I'm okay, I'm strong. We can keep things under control. I bet none of us has ever seen the Queen of England cry. She didn't do that in front of people. She's always calm, even when she's giving orders to somebody to do something to discipline somebody in her family. She looks calm, maybe just a slight smile, because she's beyond normal life. Well, she isn't really. She probably has wept over some terrible things that have happened. Well, I'm going to tell you a couple different stories about this situation. One time, many years ago in a land far away from here, there was a young minister. And he was trying really hard to learn how to preach and how to organize things. And he just focused on that so hard. And it turns out he wasn't very good at being a father or a husband, because he was so focused on these other things, and he was so worried about himself getting by. And eventually that led to a divorce. And many of you know that was me. His wife said, "You know, I cannot be with you anymore." And he was torn up about this. That was me. And I went back to Michigan, and I tried to figure out how to live my life. And I had good friends, and I had good help, and I got through that, and I got a grip on myself. And then I got called to do a ministry with people who were single or divorced. And what happened is, because of all the counseling and all the stuff that went on, when I spoke with people in those seminars, we organized seminars for people who were divorced or getting divorced. And in the Grand Rapids area, literally, when we advertised it the first time, we had to tell people, "I'm sorry, we have too many people in the room, we can't take any more." We limited it to 50, and we had to tell some to go away. I learned, though, by talking about myself honestly and just saying, here's some of the stupid mistakes I made. Here's what I learned. Here's where I really stumbled. Here's something that I did right. Here's what I'm trying to figure out now. And you think, well, that doesn't sound like a very educational thing. Except that people really benefited. They told me over and over again, they'd tell their friends, and they loved me. I'm not trying to brag. I'm trying to tell you it was by being me and being real that something good was happening. And there were so many people involved that by the third year, we had 5 main seminars a year, 8 weeks long. And at the same time, we ran 3 meetings a week in 3 other parts of the city for people to come to. There was so many people involved, I had to train teams of people who ran these things. Now, all that is just to say, being real, being honest, just being myself, it had a great effect on people. And why can't we be real? Why am I telling you this? Well, you know, when we think, well, people think I'm weak, people think, what will people think? You know, that's what my mom would say. What will people think? Well, what if we lose control once in a while? What if we just aren't so strong? What if I tell you who I really am? That's the title of a book by John Powell. Why can't I tell you who I am? And then his answer is, because I'm afraid if I do, you won't like me. That was the simple answer. The book was longer than that. But, so in church gatherings and things, you know, I was somewhere in the last few days where we talked about this too. Most of the time, if you meet somebody at church or even somewhere else, you know, at the store or whatever, and you say, well, how are you? You know what the answer is? Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. Well, we probably aren't fine 100% of the time. But we don't really think, well, I don't really want somebody to know, or I don't feel comfortable talking about it here while we're having coffee. That's okay, I'm fine. One time I was at Lowe's, and I was about 1 month into my 3-month series of cancer treatments, radiation. And I still felt fairly, normal. But so people wouldn't see anything. They wouldn't see anything wrong with me. And I met a guy who I had known, but I hadn't seen probably for a couple of years. But he'd been a part of a church that I had been at. And he met me in the men's restroom. He says, "Hi, Stan. Gee, I haven't seen you, da-da-da-da." We just chatted a few minutes, and then we were walking out. And he said, "How are you?" And I was tempted to say, "Well, I'm fine." But I didn't. I said, "Well, the truth is, I'm at risk for something pretty bad. I'm having treatments for cancer. I go to Reed City 5 days a week." And he says, "Oh, tell me more," and I just explained it to him. And we were walking outside, and he says, he said, "Let me walk over to your car with you." And I thought, what does that mean? He said, "Would it be all right if I pray for you?" And I stood there by my car, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he prayed a wonderful prayer. Well, I've never forgotten that, because it was a wonderful gift to me. And it was a gift I received because I dared to say, "No, I'm not fine. It's really bad." Well, I would like to encourage you. Sometimes it probably is better just with somebody who you have a really trusting relationship with. Maybe it's in a small group. Maybe it's in your pod or your family or some situation. Dare to be real and just say, things are kind of tough, if they are. Or I had a wonderful thing happen, grandson shot the last shot at the basketball game, and it was a three-pointer, and they won the game. Or whatever, but be real and not always about the good news. I have a feeling women are better at this than men. No? Not necessarily, huh? It's tough for all of us to be real. Jesus wept at Lazarus' tomb. Then when the other sister came, Jesus wept again. Jesus wept when he was coming into Jerusalem. He wept when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. He let it out. I have a friend who moved to this state probably 30 years ago. But one day, when he knew I was studying a certain topic, he said, "Well, a funny thing happened to me back quite a number of years ago." And he says, "You might be interested in that." He said, when I moved here, and this is like 700-800 miles, he says, I was not in good terms with my brother-in-law. He and I just sort of, we had, he didn't tell me in details. He said, when I parted, he probably said good. They didn't have a good relationship. And he said, and after I was here about a year and a half or two, a terrible thing happened. He says, I got news that my sister and brother-in-law's 2-year-old was killed, hit by a car in front of their house. And of course, this is just an awful, awful loss. And he said, and I thought, I should call them up and talk to them, but how can I do that? Because my brother-in-law probably hates me. And he said, I just put it off. And he says, after about 3 or 4 days, I went ahead and called anyway. I was hoping my sister would answer, but it was my brother-in-law that answered. And he said, I wanted to say, I'm really so sorry about what happened with Joey or whatever his name was. And please tell my sister I called and all the, And instead he said, I got started. I only got about, hello, how, I started to cry. I was trying to talk to my brother-in-law, and I couldn't get any words out, and I was just blubbering away like an idiot. And he says what happened, instead of me doing anything to comfort him, he was talking to me like, it's okay, Lawrence, it's okay. And he says he was trying to comfort and settle me down. And he says, and finally, all I could do is say, well, thanks, goodbye. And then I hung up and I thought, well, that was really stupid. And he says, I muttered to myself over that for a couple of weeks. And he says, about a year later, we had a family reunion. And I went to that family reunion. It was in Ohio or somewhere. And he says, my sister and brother-in-law were there. And he says, I felt kind of awkward. He says, and he came up to me. And he said to me, Lawrence, that was, well, first Lawrence said, I'm so sorry when I called you. I didn't even get to say anything. And his brother-in-law said, that was the best call we got. Thank you so much for how you showed your affection and your care and your love. That was the best call we got. Thank you so much. Well, he said we've been really good friends ever since. So all I'm really going to say to you, to wrap it up, I want to call on you to be more real. Just dare to be whatever you are, whatever the time and place is. You can be emotional, communicate love. You can have happy tears, sad tears. Most of us just want people to be real. And as scary as it is, let's do that. May the peace of Christ be with you. Amen.